I really think this event is incredibly important for the broader conservative libertarian movement. And I'm going to use the word conservative a lot tonight. And I will say, as I often say, I use the word as the little c conservative to refer to the broader conservative libertarian movement.
You're a side sock. You have to say conservative.
Well, that's probably true. Also, see anyways, we'll get on. Of course, everything I say tonight is really more my capacity as an individual, not FedSuck. FedSuck's a 501c3. We don't take policy stances on anything. People often like to yell at us because they think we do, so I'm going to say that to start out with. But I really wanted to just make a very basic point tonight, and that is that conservatism, broadly defined, is not just a political ideology that has something to say to poor and working class Americans. It is the political ideology that best speaks to poor and working class Americans. And that this is a fundamental understanding of the history of conservatism that's been lost, I think, on our generation or on younger generations now. And it's something I want to reemphasize. I think it is always important to kind of talk about the statistics of poverty when we kind of get into these conversations, because it's easy to kind of lose the context of what we're talking about. Right now, 46.5 million Americans live at the poverty line or below. That's up several million from 2008. I don't know what could have possibly caused that. That translates to roughly 1 in 6 Americans. This includes 60% of all children living in the city of Detroit. 70% of children born into poverty will not make it to the middle class in their lifetime. That includes 42% of children who are born in the lowest 20% of income earners who will not make it out of that bracket. A record 47.79 million Americans are on food stamps. This, of course, is up from 32 million in 2008. Again, a completely arbitrary year that I'm not referencing. But I think this kind of gets lost in the fray. So a more like local statistic that I think has been really frightening for a lot of us who live in the district or in the area is that homelessness in DC has gone up 23% since 2008. Meanwhile, as I'm sure my colleagues at AEI will maybe talk about, that economic mobility has been essentially stagnant for decades, if not declining. And I can't help but think at the end of this, where is the sense of moral, righteous indignation at what the progressive left has done to countless Americans in our country? They've inflicted pain on countless numbers of people for the past century. Where's our sense of urgency? Where is the sense of urgency of policymakers to confront the plague that is our public education system in the inner cities? To confront the damage done to local communities, to economic institutions, and not even to mention nations around the globe that have suffered as a result. So I think it's important then to understand also why we care about poverty issues. That it's not enough just to talk about poverty, that we must also also look beyond just statistics and charts and graphs. We don't care about poverty or inflation, for example, because we really want the consumer price index graph to look pretty or something. We care about inflation because it says something about the amount of bread an individual can purchase at the grocery store this weekend. How much a single mom can afford to fill up her gas tank so that she can get to work and drop her kids off at daycare and come back home. We don't care about these things because they're economically interesting or we like statistics, but because they really do have a human touch. And I agree that this has been like a great rhetorical shift, I think, in the last few years, brought on largely by people here in DC in the think tank world. Our recognition that poverty is a high priority issue for the conservative movement is rooted deeply in our principal understanding of human nature. It's more than a politically expedient way to win over voters. But in reality, it's foundational to how conservatives, broadly defined again, understand human nature. Conservatives essentially believe, as I'm sure some of you, if not all of you, already know, that humankind has a limited understanding of the nature of man and the world in which we live. And that our principles derive from the basic fact that we don't have an unlimited knowledge of human existence. And as a result, conservatism seeks to create freer societies that promote innovation and individuality and creativity and virtue, and they open markets and allow people to be risk takers and entrepreneurial. They allow communities and individuals to step up and fill the void that governments otherwise would fill. And this goes back a long way, and specifically speaking in GOP political speaking. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was the founder of the Republican Party or whatever, but also just, abhorred poverty to a great deal. Lincoln talked about his experience living in essentially what we would call third world conditions in rural Illinois as the worst time of his life. He sought to end slavery later on at some point because of his disdain for what individuals living in low-income situations had to go through. This is something core to what the conservative movement has long been about. And no, I'm not equating the Republican Party to the conservative movement. That's a whole other conversation. But I think it's interesting to note that historically, more conservative and libertarian-leaning individuals have abhorred poverty and have made it a high priority issue. Progressive politics, conversely, have largely failed. Look at the last century. The last century has basically been a grand experiment in progressive political thought, and it has largely collapsed on itself. And I hope that more and more people realize that it's largely collapsed. Progressives like Woodrow Wilson believed essentially in the perfectibility of mankind and man-made institutions, and that the right professionals consolidated enough power and the right information and enough data points that they could solve essentially any human ailment. And this is simply pure rubbish. An example I have from this is just a story from my work with the Christian Legal Aid Clinic, which has three and almost 4 now clinics around the district. I direct the clinic in Anacostia, and there was this woman who came to us once, a client in legal services, who is older in age. We'll call her June. June is about 80 years old. She came to us seeking advice because she wanted a medical power of attorney to be written up so she could have someone make medical decisions about her in case her health deteriorated. Her health was pretty bad to begin with when we were meeting with her. And June has no immediate family that's nearby. She has a brother who lives in far away in Maryland and essentially has mental health issues, so couldn't really make these sorts of decisions for her. And June went to the District of Columbia city government, asked for assistance from social worker who turned her away, asked assistance from various organizations associated with the government and was turned away, and essentially had nowhere to turn. And to someone like June to suggest, like the progressives do, that all you need is a larger government involved to make these decisions before you is absolute garbage. And moreover, we should be morally offended at the fact that this is the only solution that progressives have to offer is to go to these sorts of folks. And in fact, I think that the most inhumane response to human suffering is to tell your neighbor or a member of your community to go to a nameless, faceless bureaucrat with a clipboard. And that can't be, and that's all the left has to offer, and the right has to offer something more, and we have offered something more. So my experience at the Legal Aid Clinic has been largely an experience in understanding the limits of federal government, in part because the district is the federal government, but in part because governments have to be limited in and of themselves. It's no wonder that progressives ascribe to the theory that a collection of knowledge and a centralization of power will somehow allow them to solve all these problems, but the last 100 years has shown the complete opposite. And I think at some level they know that their ideas have failed. Take, for instance, President Obama's recent campaign to raise the minimum wage. It's been a very interesting conversation, but one of the more interesting facets I've seen of this is one of the major talking points is how this will really help the middle class. That there's no even attempt to talk about poor Americans or poverty as an issue. Elizabeth Warren, arguably one of the more liberal members of the Democratic Party, also the author of one of the most worst law school textbooks I ever had to read, gave a DNC convention speech earlier this year, last year, and referenced the middle class 8 times and only referenced poverty once. One of the more liberal, like anti-establishment, anti-Wall Street Democrats can't even bring herself to talk about poverty. Something really weird is going on the left. They can't even admit to themselves or even bring up the word poverty. And so I'm encouraged to see an entire panel of folks here at AFF willing to talk about these issues. But I think there's a point where conservatives have to be willing to step up and fill that gap and provide innovative policy solutions. And I think those innovative policy solutions have to be based in a level of practicality as well, that these solutions have to be centered on the folks that we're actually trying to help. One thing I've learned with working at the clinic has just been, like I said earlier, just the complete limits of the federal government, but how much people really want to have a better life. There really is no one in poverty that I've ever met who's in good mental health who wants to remain in their current situation, who wants to stay struggling. There's something inherent about American exceptionalism that creates this desire to grow and to have a more flourishing life. And I think that this is something that conservatives have a lot to speak about. Conservatism, broadly defined again, is a message that empowers individuals and local communities because they know what's best for other individuals and local communities. And this is something the left has nothing to say about. If you think, since the post the 2012 Romney fiasco campaign, that Republicans and the conservative movement is a loss, look at the progressive left. They have absolutely nothing new to offer in the last 100 years on the intellectual level. Meanwhile, the debates on the conservative movement between libertarians and traditional conservatives and foreign policy hawks and Paulians and Randians seems tense at times, but is much more intellectually diverse and active and dynamic and growing, while the left is essentially offering us the same stale prescriptions for human suffering that they've been offering for over 100 years, which have clearly not worked. And we have a wonderful opportunity to provide solutions. There's a great quote from Taft when he was being nominated in 1912 to run for president. And yeah, I know, nobody really talks about Taft, right? Like, who is this guy? But you can actually listen to the audio of this speech online. It's a speech called, what is it? On Popular Unrest. And the speech, he has this great quote where he's talking about all these new political parties, specifically Roosevelt and others, progressives, who have decided that the goal of government is to allow instantaneous response from the government at the will of the people. And Taft has something specific to say about this. He says, okay, so what happens when when we've changed all the governmental machinery so as to permit instantaneous expression of the people at constitutional amendments? What then? Votes are not bread, constitutional amendments are not work, referendums do not pay rent or furnish houses, recalls do not furnish clothing, initiatives do not supply employment or relieve inequalities of condition or of opportunity. And I think this is kind of where the conservative movement is at again, that we have to be ready to start offering solutions that are more than just, hey, let's talk about how bad poverty is and throw money at it, which is all the left has to offer. And I think that, interestingly, that this works well with our principles, that conservatives have a lot to say based on their principles of focus on individual liberty and individual empowerment, and community organizations have a lot to say. And the folks I've talked to at the clinic, for example, and we don't see a ton of clients. We maybe see a couple hundred clients a month between all the clinics, which isn't a lot, as much as you think. And my clients that I work with are typically like elderly folks who are living in Anacostia, a sort of working class poor that's very different from what you might consider. It's a lot of like multi-generational families living in the same housing that were built in the early 1900s. So it's really interesting questions. But what's most interesting about this is that none of these folks want to be where they're at. None of them want to continue to struggle or suffer in poverty. And that conservatives need to rise up to the occasion of developing really innovative policies and realize that these policies aren't just ideas to become politically expedient, though I think, and I'm going to talk about in a second why I think those ideas will be politically expedient. But these ideas are really deeply rooted in our political principle, and our basic understanding of human nature, and our basic understanding of our core values. I imagine, because this is an AFF event, and it's notorious for this, that there's a lot of conservatives here, and there's a lot of libertarians, and they're properly defined in those terms. And that's great. You know, you libertarians, you can have a lot to learn from us conservatives, and vice versa. and vice versa, okay, so I'm being fair. But the point is this, like, our basic understanding of human nature is much more alike than our understanding of how individuals operate in the face of a centralized government is pretty much the same. And though we may disagree on some ancillary but not unimportant issues on the sides, our understanding of where the country ought to go is much more alike. And the bigger threat we face isn't from the progressive left, who's intellectually bankrupt at this point, but rather from our own inability to work with one another. And the fact that we can come together in a room and talk about innovative policies to address one of the most pressing issues in the country right now is pretty remarkable. And I think that's something that we ought to be, want to consider. And I'm sure I'm running out of time at this point, so I'll probably stop. But again, just to summarize, like, my main point, if you walk away from anything, is just to understand that conservative and libertarian philosophical approaches to the role of government and the value of the individual have a lot to say about poverty, much more than the left does. And that it's time that we work together kind of on a philosophical perspective and apply these positions, or apply these policies and ideas to the individuals who we're trying to help. And I didn't get to talk enough about the kind of individual level, but I'm going to pass it off to the other panelists and maybe more in the Q&A.
There'll be lots of time, hopefully.